Can you tell us a bit about health technology assessment and the health system in Canada, Deb?
Oh, I'd love to tell you about the health system in Canada. Depends how much time you have. So let's start with, yes, we have universal health care in Canada. So our system is in many ways a lot like the Australian system. It's a lot like the systems in the UK and in Europe, and is very unlike the large country that sits below Canada. So let's put that system aside. So in Canada, we have a federal piece of legislation called the Canada Health Act, and that ensures that we do not pay for anything that's done to us in a hospital. We never pay for a doctor's visit. We don't pay to give birth to a child, et cetera, et cetera. All of that is automatically covered from our tax dollars that we are happy to pay. And it's one thing that as Canadians, if anybody tries to muddle with the idea of universal healthcare, they get shot down in a hurry. So we believe in universal healthcare. But that said, we also have a system similar to your states. We have provinces, and each province has jurisdiction over how healthcare is implemented in their province. So there really isn't one Canadian health system. There's many, at least a dozen, depending upon where you live. And when that comes to access to medications, we are trying our best to harmonize across the country. But as I'm sure is true in other countries, there are parts of the country that have more money than other parts. And so if you live in a part of the country in our East Coast, a small island, you might not have access to the same medication. And that's just a reality of our Canadian system. But as I said, we're very proud to have universal healthcare coverage and all of the problems and challenges that that brings to us.
And so for something to be provided under that system, does it have to go through a system similar to ours in Australia that uses health technology assessment?
Yes, we have, Canada has a very well established HTA system that is actually not a federal system, but it's called a pan-Canadian system. So all the provinces come together at a table and fund the HTA for all of Canada. So in theory, we would have some universality of recommendations and decisions. So that's where we're working together. So HTA is well grounded. We also have separately from our HTAs, we have our regulatory agency. So the way that we map a drug, I'm saying a drug, but it could be a technology, a drug, normally we pay attention when the FDA approves something. My personal opinion is that the bar at the FDA is getting lower and lower and lower. So the FDA often approves something with accelerated approval. It comes through very quickly. And then we start our clocks and we start watching what happens. So usually it's submitted to our regulatory. That will come through usually in about 6 months from the US. And so that's good. That means the drug is safe and effective. And if you have private insurance on top of the universal coverage, you might be able to access it then once it's been regulatory approved. But for the vast majority of Canadians, they have to wait for HTA to go through its process, and then for the pricing negotiations, which in our system is actually a subsequent step, for the pricing negotiations to happen with the government. And so that entire timeline from FDA, if I count it from the US, to a patient having access in Canada, that can be 2 years. And so that's, you know, I work in cancer, I volunteer my time in cancer, and in advanced cancer, you can't wait 2 years if something is really effective. So as patient groups, we have to understand that whole system and kind of follow a drug through its many steps. It gets stuck sometimes, and sometimes it gets stuck because industry's not negotiating to the extent that the government wants them to. And so what we do is we don't get involved in that per se, but what we do is we make sure that a patient in need has access somehow, some way. And so as patient groups, we have sort of a list of, I'll say, tactics of what we will go through. But we push for compassionate access programs. we push for, very quietly giving a patient access and not letting it get to the media. And then in worst case scenario, we'll go for the front page. That's not ideally how HTA works. I'm sorry, I said it.
But I understand the need there. And so in Australia, in our HTA Health Technology Assessment System, patients can really only start to get involved in the medicines assessments at that appraisal stage when it's coming into committee for that deliberation. I think in Canada they can get involved a bit earlier, can they? And how does that happen? And can you tell us a bit about your thoughts about earlier involvement in this area?
Yeah, I think my overall thought is that at HTA appraisal, it's too late. I mean, yes, you absolutely have to get involved because you need to state the position and to do your best for patients. But it really is too late in the game when you have, data from trials and it's not what you wanted. And sometimes they've used the wrong comparison drug and, all kinds of things that you wanted collected were not even asked. So it's a pretty crappy point in time to come in at the very end and to have been ignored for all of the steps prior to that. So I would say that in Canada right now, officially with our HTAs, we don't have a seat at early scientific advice when companies are first saying, I'm thinking about, approaching about this drug. So we don't get involved at that point. There is a two-step part of it's called CADTH is our agency. We have 2 steps where we can get involved, but I would really urge patient groups to think about how much of your resources do you want to spend at the end versus how much do you want to spend in trying to influence the data that you're going to end up with. So I've become involved much more in clinical trial design, and Canada's a huge country geographically, but we don't really matter that much to drug companies if we're honest. For global pharmaceutical companies, the Canadian population at like 37 million is just like a blip. So what we've realized is if you want to influence the clinical trial, you have to get to the global pharmaceutical company. So work through your country organization, but try to get at those tables where you're discussing unmet patient needs, what we can do better in the next trial, how we need to better measure things like quality of life, because measuring it in these questionnaires doesn't make any sense. So there's a need to do that. There's a need to do that early stuff. But if you are finding yourself and it's late in the day and you have 30 days, that's our window in Canada, 30 days to put together an HTA submission, then you scramble. And what we do when we're scrambling is we go out to patients with patient surveys and we try to ask the questions that the trial didn't ask. And we also try to ask questions that the pharmaceutical industry cannot or will not ask. So for example, the pharmaceutical industry, if there's a couple of drugs out there already, we can ask patients if they've had an experience with drug A and drug B and drug C. We can ask patients how they might consider like the side effect profiles. What was their experience? And drug companies could never do that because if they haven't done those trials, they can't speak to that. So we ask patients for their experience. And I think what's really important is we ask patients for their words, because there's a lot of data thrown at HTA. And what I feel that we can do is we can bring the humanity. And so we want the patient words, even if they're spelled wrong, even if the grammar is terrible, we want from their words that, they could not walk up the stairs before, but the difference in the shortness of breath symptom means that they can get upstairs and for the first time in 2 years, they've been able to sleep in their bed. Something that really brings the message home, because we are ultimately working to persuade people and to get them outside of the data box for just a minute. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And there's a lot in what you just said there. So what I was hearing, that is, if we want to perform HTA in Australia, it's going to change all of us, and it demands better evidence coming through from industry that really speaks to what's important to patients, and that requires earlier involvement of patient organisations right back in that early stage. And then when I was thinking about what you were saying you would do in that late submission, which we have the opportunity currently in Australia to do, is you're looking for the gaps in the evidence, what's missing. So do you have access to a copy of the application that goes to a body like CADTH, or a summary, or how do you know what's in there? Is there an interaction with the company at that stage?
Not officially. So we've tried before to get the company submission, because we don't want to replicate that. We're not about talking about the efficacy data, you know, that's not what we're supposed to be doing or what we want to be doing. So what we do is go banging on the door or making a phone call to the pharmaceutical company to say, we have some questions and we'd like for you to answer those questions. Depending upon the relationship, sometimes they will say, send them to us in writing, and then they will run it through their legal departments before they answer the questions, you know. But however you can form that relationship, you do that in a way that doesn't compromise your integrity. So I wouldn't ever allow a pharmaceutical company to say, well, we will hire a consultant for you who will help you with this. No, that's not okay. Ours has to be independent. But we will ask the pharmaceutical company questions. We will also ask the treating clinicians. So if we can find the doctors who were involved in the clinical trial, we can then ask them some questions about what their experience was. And sometimes they can even refer us to patients who were on that clinical trial. So here's a challenge for you, because I think of Australia and Canada being similar kind of satellite countries in the pharma world, is that we don't often have all of the trials run in our country. So they say, go and survey some patients, find some patients and ask them all these questions. Well, sometimes we can barely find 10 patients in our entire country who had experience with the drug. And so then you've got a survey of 10 patients. It doesn't feel like it's substantial enough. But what we have learned to do is to connect our disease groups internationally. So when I'm doing an HTA submission for a new drug, the first thing I will do is to call my counterpart in the UK to say, have you already done a patient survey for this drug and this indication? And they'll say, oh yeah, we did that, 6 weeks ago. And then I'll get that information. And sometimes I go on to the online international patient sites and say, we have a short survey, and it doesn't matter where in the world you live. If you've had experience with this drug, we just need a bit of your input, and this will help Canadian patients. So we do that, and our HTA fully acknowledges that we might have to go outside of country to find patients, because otherwise, if you find 2 patients, what are you going to say?
Oh, that's really helpful to understand too. And one of the other things I noticed in the Canadian system is this thing called scientific advice, or early dialogue, or early scientific advice. What's that about?
It's not about us, unfortunately. I mean, we've tried to get patients to be involved in that. It's really for a manufacturer, so a pharmaceutical company, to pay, and they pay the HTA agency to get some advice. So if they've got a really crackpot trial that's going to compare a drug against a very weak competitor, then the scientific advice might be, don't do that, because we're not going to pay attention to that kind of comparison. So it's done between the manufacturer and the HTA agency, but because of all kinds of confidentiality, et cetera, patients aren't involved at that stage. And even when we are invited to be involved and to send our submission, they give us a template with some questions that we're supposed to answer. Well, maybe we answer them occasionally, but usually we answer the questions that we want to answer. So if they ask us about the burden of the disease, so how does the disease make patients feel? That if we've already answered that 6 months ago, we're not going to answer it again. So we just use the space to tell them what the really important things are about this new intervention. So we mess around with what we're going to send in a little bit, because they prescribe it and we're saying, no, we don't like your pre-formatted questions. So we do that, we send that in. We often reference a patient survey that we've done just anyhow. You know, patient organizations do surveys all the time. And then sometimes they get back to us and they say, could you send us the questions, please, that you asked and the raw data? And we're happy to send that in. So rather than take up all the space. So we put the submission in, and then after the submission has gone through, there's a deliberative meeting. We're not invited to that deliberation meeting. We're not on the phone. We have nothing to do with that. So we send it in and we get an acknowledgement that it has been received. And then there's a meeting that happens, and there is a public and or patient representative who then represents our submission, which again, I don't think is best practice. I think the best practices are really in England and in Scotland, where patient groups can be there in person to answer questions. But in our system, we're not involved. We get their draft recommendation, and we have an opportunity to appeal at that point or send in a second submission if we think they have not followed due process. But it's not just to say, I disagree. You can't just disagree. You have to have a reason for disagreeing. So, so that is the process. And then it becomes a final recommendation once we've all had an opportunity to say, yes, you did something, or no, you didn't consider X, Y, and Z. So that's how our system works. It's a work in progress. It's not perfect. And personally, I look to Scotland and to England as having far better advancements, I think, in patient engagement in HTA.
That's interesting. So same here, as we can't see what goes on in these HTA meetings, but a slight different in process there in this ability to see a draft recommendation and to provide something. But that's great, because as you know, we're talking to Scotland and England patient organisations in this series, so we'll explore that further as well. Mm-hmm. So do you get feedback about the input or the submissions you make?
Yes, and that has actually been something positive in the last few years. We demanded some feedback, because otherwise it was just like throwing something over a wall. And so now there's a feedback letter. Now, I'll be honest to say that it's not always helpful. So sometimes they will say, you know, we acknowledge that you did an online survey, but it was only, you know, a small sample. Well, you know, we did our best. Sometimes we've had feedback that says you didn't pull enough of the Indigenous population, of the rural population, of Canada's far north, and you read this in the feedback and you think, how on earth could we? This is a volunteer effort. And, you know, sometimes they say an online survey is limited, that you really should be doing one-on-one interviews with patients. So we are resource restrained, and they want, you know, the stars, the moon, and everything. And we just can't get there. We need to be a fully fledged research agency to deliver everything that they want. And you know, and I've sometimes questioned, you know, how much money or what they think we really do, because, you know, in the organization that I started in Canada, Kidney Cancer Canada, we are there to help patients who've just had a life-threatening diagnosis. That is our raison d'etre, if I can throw in a bit of French. And so that's what we do. That's our mandate. This other HTA stuff of doing patient surveys and trying to find patients who are taking this drug, that's separate, but it's also really important. And so sometimes it's a little bit disheartening when they say, well, here are all the things that you didn't do. You know, I was busy helping a patient stay alive that day. There.
Yeah, so that brings us nicely to actually this question of timely access, which, you know, is sometimes part of that's helping a patient stay alive that day area. What are the options in your system in Canada? Are there options for earlier access? I know you mentioned it's 2 years from FDA approval. What are your thoughts on timely access? What does it mean to you, and what does it look like in the Canadian system?
Yeah, it's a challenge. I'll be honest to say it's a challenge, and it's different in very many circumstances. So we don't have kind of, I'll call it a backdoor fund for cancer drugs like in the UK they have, in England they have the Cancer Drugs Fund. We don't have anything like that. So we have to know where a system is in the process, and then know, is there an opportunity for us to somehow get that patient that drug? If it's still before, if I get this straight, if it's still before Health Canada with the regulatory agency, sometimes we can appeal with the physician, we can appeal to Health Canada to say, can we get early access? But once it's already fallen through that piece of the puzzle, then we have to know where it's at, and and whether it's funded in some places and not other places yet. And so we use all the tools that we can to get the patient the drug that they need. What's really important is timely access depends upon who you are. And for a patient, and especially with cancer that's metastatic, you cannot wait for all of the check boxes to occur. You need to seize the window of opportunity, or that patient will lose that chance to ever have that drug. So I can't be really prescriptive of what we do, because it depends upon where the system is. But do we lean on industry sometimes? Oh, you bet we do. That if a pharma company says, our belief is we're a patient-centered company, they all are, and we will leave no patient behind, we will challenge them on that and say, here's a patient that you're leaving behind, and they should not be penalized because we're stuck in the negotiation somewhere. So we push pretty hard, and sometimes physicians will tell their patient, go to the patient organization, because they can lobby, even though we're not officially allowed to use that word lobby. We're not lobbyists. So that's what we do. So timely access, I want to make sure that the drug is safe and that it works. So it's safe and effective. I don't care how much it costs, because that's for other people to work through. But as soon as it's got regulatory approval, then we know it's safe and effective. If a patient is in dire need for it and they have no other options, then we should go to the wall for that patient. And I hope that that's a sentiment that other patient organizations would agree with.
Thanks, Deb. And as you know, we're scheduled to have an HTA review here in Australia over the next 12 months. And we're also, as part of that, I should say, we're having work is being done to co-design an enhanced consumer engagement system. And I wondered, what aspects of the Canadian system do you think are really good that we should look at and learn from?
Well, I know you use that word consumer, and we don't use that word consumer. So I think one of the aspects has been patient involvement in the deliberative committees. There's a very different tone when you have a patient representative versus a public representative. So there's a distinction there. And I think certainly in the cancer drugs review, we've made sure that there is a patient representative, because if you haven't had a diagnosis like this and you're thinking that all drugs are the same, you don't have the same urgency. So that is something I think that we can offer that has been really good. In other pieces of our system, the opportunity to appeal, or to come back on the draft recommendation, that's been really important to us. And that feedback letter that we get at the end, even if we don't always like it, the feedback letter is also important. I think where I'd like to see us go forward is to have more one-on-one trusted dialogue between the patient organization and the HTA people inside. What often happens, and forgive me because I know you have academic credentials, but what often happens is that they hire people who have PhDs in patient engagement, and they go off and have these discussions among themselves about, patient engagement and how it should be done, but it's all very academic and sort of obtuse. And I think what we bring is what it's like actually as a patient when you are trying to navigate your disease at the same time as that you're trying to navigate drug access and the financial implications of all of that. So, so we bring a dose of reality to people who have studied patient engagement, but they haven't walked it the way that we've walked it. Sorry for your academic credentials.
My academic credentials, I wouldn't overstate, but I would really think that we do underestimate what patients with lived experience bring to this. So I think your point is really important and valid to this discussion. Is there anything else about the system or this space in general that you'd like to share with the patient organisations and patients in Australia in this?
I think I would just like to emphasize for anybody who's feeling daunted or really, yikes, we're just a small patient group. We can't possibly do what's being asked of us. So then don't do everything. Do the minimum of putting in a passionate plea, even if it's a letter. Do something, because if you don't do something, they're going to make the decisions based upon clinical evidence and cost effectiveness only. And the missing piece of the puzzle will be, what do the patient organizations think about this? And if you don't submit, all they can think is that there isn't patient interest. So one of the parts I'm really proud of in our cancer drugs in Canada, that over 95% of the submissions, even for the rarest cancer drugs, they have a patient submission. Are they all of the same quality? Absolutely not. But every time some group puts something in. And so some of the umbrella organizations, I know in Australia you have Rare Cancers Australia, but for some of those bigger groups to pick up a submission when nobody else is going to be able to do it, I think it's vital. And they can't do this without us. They should not be allowed to do this without us. That's my plea.